Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to today's special event, which is the second Science Sundays event since we've resumed in this spring. I'm John Beacom. I'm the chair of the Science Sundays Committee. I'm representing physics and astronomy, but the Science Sundays Committee spans the whole range of the arts and sciences, not only including natural and mathematical sciences, where I am, but also social and behavioral sciences, and also even arts and humanities. As a research leader, Ohio State seeks to expand the frontiers of knowledge, to understand the importance of this knowledge to understanding our complex society, and to enrich individual imaginations and our collective culture. And Science Sundays is the premier outreach event of the College of Arts and Sciences for sharing the fruits of our research with the public. And we're delighted to see you here, and we hope to see you again. For those of you who have not already done so, it's easy to sign up for the Science Sundays email list. You get about one email per month. And starting next year, we'll have, instead of the original little booklets, we'll have a different thing for you to bring home and keep as a memento and to remind you of future events. So today, we're honored to host Professor David Staley. His home base is in the Department of History, but he also has courtesy appointments in design and education studies. David is the author of several well-regarded books and accessible books to the public. He is the president of the Ohio Academy of History, and he's a leading figure in communicating the results of research to the public himself. For example, through his Voices of Excellence audio series that he's been doing for several years, and which will be ramping up in the near future. So without further ado, let's welcome David.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for coming out on an unexpectedly beautiful February afternoon. I take that as a great honor that you would spend at least a little bit of time with us here today. As John says, I am trained as an historian. I'm housed in the history department, and I am an historian, but I'm also a futurist. And so I feel like I need to at least spend a minute to describe what it means to be a futurist. Obviously, I'm interested in the future. I describe futurists as scholars of the possible. And there's actually a growing scholarly movement in the study of anticipation, in the study of possibility, in the study of what's next. Futurists are interested in anticipating what's next. And I hope by the end of my talk to be able to convince you, because I've had to convince myself, that historians actually make pretty good futurists. And that's part of what I want to try to accomplish here today. The other thing I want to start off with and to maybe convince you of is any time I am asked to talk about the future, to give a talk on the future, either I'm asked to give a talk or an audience in front of an audience, or if I'm asked to do any consulting, which I sometimes do. What's clear to me is that when someone says they want to know what the future is, what they really mean is that they want to know what some system is going to look like in the future. How is a particular system going to be behaving in the future? So when we say, what's the future of healthcare? What's the future of artificial intelligence? What's the future of biotechnology? What's behind that question is a statement about what is the particular sort of configuration of a system going to look like. And that's where I wanted to begin my talk today, with an understanding about systems, because you can't do foresight, you can't do futuring without an understanding of systems, and in particular, complex adaptive systems. What we tend to study as futurists are these particular systems. Now, I've created a visualization here, a crude visualization of something you've probably all heard of, the butterfly effect. The idea that a butterfly flapping its wings somewhere in West Africa will disturb the air around it enough that, given the complexity of the atmosphere, it can change the behavior of weather systems such that it creates a hurricane over the Atlantic. That's the butterfly effect, and that's because we're talking about a complex system. What is oftentimes not said about the butterfly effect is that same butterfly could flap its wings and maybe do little more than just disturb the air around it. You can never know with certainty what the effect of the butterfly's flapping its wings is going to have. And again, that is very central to complex adaptive systems. This is my drummed up definition, if you'll forgive it. Agents in dynamic interaction with each other such that the aggregate behavior of the system cannot be determined simply by adding up the behaviors of the agents. In other words, a system is made up of objects, people, animals, other types of systems. And you cannot simply understand the behavior of the larger system by sort of adding up, what's this agent doing, and what's this agent doing, what's this agent doing. Oftentimes, the behaviors of complex adaptive systems exhibit emergent behavior. Unexpected system-spanning behaviors emerge from these dynamic interactions. Prediction of the behavior of the system is often not possible. The way my colleagues in the sciences might put it, such systems are deterministic, but not predictable. And in fact, what we are often reduced to, if you will, is understanding the history of systems, not necessarily making predictions about them. Here are some more features of complex adaptive systems. They exhibit what's called sensitivity to initial conditions. That means that if the butterfly flapping its wings produces a hurricane, if we were to rewind the script and have it do it again, if there's even the slightest deviation in the initial conditions, it could produce a very different sort of result. So systems, complex adaptive systems, are sensitive to those initial conditions. As I said, emergence is one of the phenomena of these systems, that behaviors that were unexpected from the individual parts frequently occur. That's why complex systems are different, say, from complicated systems or even simple systems. Systems have unique histories, which is why they draw my attention as an historian, and they exhibit nonlinearity or nonlinear change. And what that often means, like in the case of the butterfly, is that a relatively small change can, not in every instance, but can have outsized effects. So in simple systems, a small change or a small action might produce a small change, or a big action might produce a big change. But in these systems, even small actions can create large system-spanning changes. And the thing is, we can never know with certainty what they'll look like, what sorts of behaviors will be produced. Let me start off here by saying these kinds of systems are probably more common than we usually assume. Simple systems are actually the exception, I think, in nature. And when you throw human beings into the mix, well, that just adds more and more and more complexity. This is something that I think historians qualitatively understand. These kinds of systems are the norm in nature. Frequently, however, we act as if systems are relatively simple. And what I mean by that, this could take all sorts of cases, but an immediate case is Silicon Valley technologists. We're just going to release a technology out into the world because we know what its effects are going to be. The problem is, when they release technologies into the wild, as it were, they're releasing them into complex adaptive systems. And anytime we talk about the unforeseen effects of technology, the reason they were unforeseen is that, well, the technologists probably weren't thinking in terms of complex adaptive systems. Either we ignore them, or we assume them away, or we try to treat the world as if it were a simple system. Or, and I hope this isn't the case, or we just don't care. Technologists just simply don't care. We'll just sort of release them into the wild, as it were. Complex adaptive systems. Historians, I think, are very, very keen. Even if they lack the formal mathematics of, say, physicists, we are very keen, certainly in a qualitative sense, to understand these kinds of systems. And in fact, I'll make the argument that that's what historians study. We study complex adaptive systems from the past. Take, for instance, the case of nonlinearity, and this is a very simple example, but I think a very good example, the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand, which unleashes the First World War, the Great War. Again, a small change having outsized effects, and that's because the European system was a highly complex adaptive system. And in history, I think we frequently study nonlinear emergent behavior from these complex systems. It's and this is going to maybe come as a surprise to history majors and my history colleagues, but I'd like to redefine history as the study of the past behavior of complex adaptive systems. We lack, or we choose not to use, formal mathematics to do this. We tend to do this in a qualitative sense. But I am convinced that what historians are studying is very similar to what physicists are studying, physicists like John are studying. And it's from this, then, I would like to argue that what we do as historians in studying past behavior of complex systems can be pointed forward toward the future. We can do the same thing in thinking about the future. So, and I understand he's a controversial figure. Some of you might find him a controversial figure. Starting in the 1960s, the study of the future, the scholarship of what's possible, underwent a major transformation. Gone were the days of prediction. In their place was a new type of thinking called scenario modeling or scenario thinking. Anytime I get up in front of a group to talk about the future, I say, anyone that stands in front of you and says they can predict the future is lying to you, or lying to themselves, but in any event, someone's being lied to, for reasons I've just talked about here, because we're talking about complex systems. Herman Kahn and others at the Rand Corporation in the 1960s were working on ways of thinking about the possibilities around thermonuclear war. In fact, this is why Kahn is sometimes a controversial figure. He wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, and people thought this is terrible because he was thinking through the implications of an exchange of hydrogen bombs or nuclear weapons from the United States and Soviet Union. People thought, how could you do that? How could you think about something like that? What Kahn and others at Rand were using, though, was the tool called scenarios, and this was Kahn's definition of a scenario. A rich and detailed portrait, a story, a narrative, of a plausible future world. One sufficiently vivid that a planner can clearly see and comprehend the problems, challenges, and opportunities that such an environment would present. A scenario is not a prediction. It's a story about what the world could look like. And in fact, in scenario thinking, you're usually generating more than one scenario. You're thinking about 3, 4, 5 scenarios because the future is indeterminate, the future is unpredictable, yet we can posit possible behaviors a system might take. And I hope you don't think I'm just playing linguistic games here when I talk like this. When I say we don't make predictions, I use that very advisedly. A prediction assumes that the future is already in existence. It's already there, and all we have to do is let time pass before we can stumble upon it. There are some facets of the future that behave like that. We know with a fair amount of certainty when the next solar eclipse is going to be. We can probably, right down to the day, maybe even the time, tell when the next solar eclipse is going to be. And that's because the movement of the planets around the sun is actually a relatively simple system. Most of what we're interested in about the future, however, isn't already formed. It looks something like this. In fact, I sometimes say that the future is kind of a quantum state. It both is and isn't at the same time. There are facets of the future that are already in place, but there are just as many facets of the future that have yet to form. And this is the world that we want to explore. This is the world that futurists explore. So when we say we make scenarios, plural, this is what we have in mind, that we tend not to think in terms of one possibility, but many different possibilities. Any one of these futures could be the ones that unfold before us. I got some insight into this in the early 1990s. This book, The Art of the Long View, was published by Peter Schwartz, I want to say in 1990, so it was right around that time. What Schwartz did, Schwartz was the founder of what was called the Global Business Network, which was sort of a corporate consulting firm that used a lot of the techniques that Rand were using in the 1960s, just applying it to business cases as opposed to geostrategic realities. And I remember reading this book because I had an interest in the future. I'd always had an interest in the future, even though I was an historian. And I was really struck by this quote here that was on page 37. I can tell you almost exactly where it is, on page 37. He was describing the scenario method. He was describing scenario thinking. He was describing different possibilities rather than single-line predictions. And he said, some people are immediately great at building scenarios. Others need more practice. I've got an ellipses there because he sort of throws under the bus the disciplines that don't do scenarios very well, and I'm not going to mention those here. But he does say the anthropologist is more in tune to uncertainty and multiple points of view and can more easily accept the practice of scenarios. The same is true for historians. And I read that and I said, of course, because what you're describing is the historical method. Except rather than looking backward to the past, you're looking forward to the future. That insight led me to this sort of conclusion, that history, as a discipline, history it can be the anticipation of the future behavior of complex adaptive systems. That we can redefine at least our practices to be about anticipating what's coming next, not just simply describing what happened before, but anticipating what's happened next. That insight, that was the book that you saw in my opening there. I sort of laid this out, why historians make good futurists. I assume I can put plug in for books, John. You're not gonna yank me off the stage for that. This is a book I just published in November. It was a collection of my columns for Columbus Underground. I do a monthly column on the future called Next. And so I've collected these in this book. And these are all examples of how being an historian makes one, I think, a very good futurist. In fact, I would argue it's the best training for being a futurist, for being a scholar of the possible. So I thought what I would do with that sort of in mind is to describe what's possible. What's possible with a number of different kinds of systems. In other words, think about what the future might look like across a number of different systems. Let's start with social systems. And in fact, for futurists, I think this is the hardest to think about. I'm going to talk about technology here in just a bit. In some ways, technology is the easiest for a futurist to think through. And it's the one that most people seem to have the most interest in. But social systems are actually of great importance, but are also maybe even more complex than technological systems. And so it's difficult for us not to imagine the possibilities, but to even begin to ponder whether we could predict them or not. I don't think we can. I did an exercise with my students once where I had them think through the future of some technology. And of course they did it and they had lots of ideas and they were talking up for about 20, 25 minutes. And then I said, what sort of music will college students be listening to in 20 years? Silence. No ideas. No ideas at all. It's much, much harder to think through. So social systems present their own sort of specific challenge. So what I'd like to suggest about social systems is it's possible that what we're going to see in the future is a new kind of cultural or intellectual movement that I'm calling essentialism. And that's going to define the 2020s, maybe even beyond. And that this was fueled in many ways by the pandemic that we are still living through today. And it starts with this question that was asked by the Gallup organization. Is quiet quitting real? Let's leave aside for a fact that the term quiet quitting is maybe not the best term to describe the phenomenon. Quiet quitting is, from a particular sort of vantage point from the employer rather than the employee. But if I can summarize what Gallup had determined, it's that, yeah, quiet quitting is a real thing. And it's something that has persisted long after the sort of the high point of the pandemic. Quiet quitting, as you probably already know, is the phenomenon that we're seeing in the workforce where people, well, to put it simply, they're not working above and beyond. They're doing exactly what their job description says, no more, no less. Because doing more is taking away from their time spent with family or doing other sorts of things. Giving to a company or an organization with, aside from a pat on the back, with little other sort of rewards in return. And so the pollsters and others have been seeing more evidence of what's called quiet quitting. I mean, these are not people quitting their jobs. They're still at their jobs, and they still do a good job, and they still get good performance reviews. They're not necessarily going above and beyond, because maybe there are other things that are more important than my job performance. And that's the phenomenon that we're starting to see witness to. And why not? We're living at a time, we haven't seen anything quite like it, I would argue, in at least 40 years, where workers are gaining leverage over employers. And we see this in all sorts of ways, not the least of which that the working age population has been shrinking for some time. The working age population is, well, it's growing older and it's retiring. And so there are just simply fewer working age people. This is part of why, not the only reason, it's part of the reason why we're seeing such high inflation right now. It has to do with wage inflation, because workers have much more leverage than they have in a long time. We're seeing strikes, of course, all throughout Europe. We're seeing strikes in England. Faculty are on strike in England, for instance. But we're also seeing, if not strikes and if not union activity, then certainly worker activism of a kind we've not seen since at least the 1980s in this country. It tends to be, at Amazon, baristas at Starbucks. But again, we've not seen anything quite like this, and it signals that there's something significant happening in the world of work. And I would argue it's not necessarily about wages. I was really struck, and I don't know where we stand today on the, are we on again or off again with the railroad strike? I think we're off again, but it could be on again, it seems. But what's really interesting about this whole phenomenon, the threat to strike, is the railroad workers, yeah, they were going to get, I think it was like a 24% raise or something like that, but that was not the reason for their threatened strike. What they wanted was time off. They want time off work, which apparently railroad workers don't have. They want to be able to, take time off. They want to be able to take sick days. They want to be able to take a parent to a doctor. They want time off away from work. And they're ready to strike for that because this is something they don't have. That, to me, is another piece of evidence. What we're seeing is a very, very different sort of mood right now. Not just simply in this country, but around the world. We're seeing something similar in China, where a movement called the lying flat movement has taken hold. And again, this was occurring before the pandemic, but in some ways was accelerated by it. I don't know how else to describe it other than to say that young people in China are kind of tired of being told to work hard and work extra hard and do more for the glory of China so that China may rise. And young people are like, yeah, no, we don't want to do that. And lying flat means literally just sort of stopping and doing nothing and taking time for me as opposed to these larger goals set by others. And this is mostly among China's young people. This is a pretty significant movement that we're seeing. This book, I've not read it, full confession, I've not read it, Ikigai. The Japanese concept meaning a reason for being. By the way, my understanding is the Japanese don't actually use this term. It's not sort of a big deal in Japan. But it was an international bestseller. It sold like 3 million copies. And essentially, this idea of reason for being is, again, my reason for being is not to work really hard or to make my company lots of money. My reason for being is my life, the quality of my life. And again, I see, inasmuch as there are readers around the world for this sort of work, it signals a really significant social mood change that's taking place. The piece I wrote in my column for December of 2020 laid out this idea of neo-essentialism, that we are witness, I think, to a social or an intellectual movement that's like existentialism in the 1950s or transcendentalism in the 19th century. And we use that term essential all during the pandemic, right? That person is an essential worker. And of course, that term sort of lost its edge as we moved out of the pandemic. Maybe they're not so essential anymore, was the idea. What I argued is that we have all sort of learned that maybe what we should be focusing on is what is essential in our lives. And maybe that's not the job. Maybe that's not work. Maybe it's family. Maybe it's volunteering at my church. Maybe it's something else that gives my life meaning. And that this is going to be, we are going to recognize this, I think, as a much more significant social phenomenon. So that's one possibility for the future in the social realm. Technological systems. Well, I could spend the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening talking about technology. I spent a lot of time talking about artificial intelligence. I could give a whole talk right now on GPT-3, which is so much in the news right now. I would like to suggest the possibility that in 10 years, when we say technology, we're not going to mean something on our phone. we're going to mean something organic and alive and squishy. And that's going to be what we mean by technology. So starting with the work of, well, Rosalind Franklin, if I want to be sort of clear about it, but Watson and Crick as well, we've come to understand that DNA, the stuff of life, is a kind of code. In fact, not unlike computer code. We have spent a fair amount of time, and well into, I guess, into the early 2000s, we were learning how to understand that code. That's what the Human Genome Project was about. We can understand sort of the grammar of that code. We're now moving into an era where some scientists are actually starting to write or rewrite the code, manipulate it in ways that they would computer code. Maybe the most newsworthy example would be CRISPR, if you're familiar with CRISPR technology. I sometimes call it sort of the find and replace function, except with DNA. It's a technology, and I'm going to vastly oversimplify it, that can literally find a section of DNA that is problematic or causes some sort of disease or something like that. You can remove it and replace it with the DNA that you want. That technology, and it's obviously still very complicated, that technology is much simpler now. And we are now able to alter DNA, edit DNA in the same way that we could edit computer code. And I don't think I'm overstating it to refer to DNA and RNA as a kind of code. I just took this from WebMD. Look at the way in which they're talking about the mRNA vaccines. They refer to them as technology. And there's a reason for that, and part of the reason has to do with the code that underlies it. So you can actually go online and find the code in the same way that I can go to GitHub to get computer code. In fact, I think you can go on GitHub. In fact, the next one, no. You can go to GitHub and actually get the source code for the Pfizer mRNA vaccines. That has all kinds of implications, especially when homebrew clubs want to start manipulating their own DNA sequences, which I think is something that is very, very possible. But when we talk about life, when we talk about DNA as a kind of technology, this is the sort of thing we're talking about, and we are manipulating life in all sorts of ways. There are people that are saying we need to be re-engineering trees to make it easier for them or more efficient for them to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. In fact, there's one company that's already claiming to be the Tesla for trees, already talking in this kind of language of biological life forms as being engineered and designed in some fashion. I can give you all sorts of other examples. There are some labs now that are working on genetically modifying pigs such that their organs would be able to be transplanted into a human being. Not just any human being. That pig's liver could be transplanted into me to replace my liver. That has all kinds of ethical and other sorts of consequences that I'm not certain that we've thought through completely, because this is a complex adaptive system. So when I talk about biotechnology being our definition of technology, this is the sort of thing I have in mind. This publication no longer exists, but I find very evocative of what we could see in the future. So this was from O'Reilly, biocoder. I chose this image here deliberately to sort of glaze this out right here. We're accustomed to thinking of a coder as someone who's writing computer code, ones and zeros and those sorts of things. 10 years from now, a coder might be somebody who's manipulating GTCA, that's manipulating DNA and RNA technologies. That's when I say it's possible that in 10 years, when we say technology, when we talk about a tech job or the tech sector, we're going to be talking about those who are manufacturing life. I'm using that term very, very deliberately. Economic systems. Where to begin? Wow, where to begin with economic systems? So I was going to say that as of last fall, there was still a lot of talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And then FTX happened, and now maybe we're not talking about it so much. I gave a talk in September at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and I said to them, is Bitcoin, is cryptocurrency actual money? And the answer is no, but it could be actual money. It's not actual money today. You can make some purchases with it. The problem is that not enough places accept cryptocurrency. There's some, you can go to San Francisco and buy a lot of things. I think you can buy a latte or something like that with your cryptocurrency. But part of the problem with it is that it's so volatile. The value of cryptocurrency is so volatile. I hate to pick on a guy when he's down, but I'm going to pick on a guy when he's down. When Odell Beckham Jr. signed with the Los Angeles Rams, he signed a contract, the football player, he signed a contract for $750,000. He insisted on being paid in Bitcoin. By the end of the season, it was worth $35,000. Again, I don't want to kick a guy when he's down, but, oh yeah, I'm going to kick a guy when he's down, I guess. So, and what that signal, so now when I say that, he's treating Bitcoin as if it were currency. And it's not currency today, but it could be. In fact, it's Economics 101. Anything can be currency if we all agree that it's currency. That's what I learned in the first day of economics. You see two people exchanging things. One has a metal disc, the other has a shell. They exchange. The question asked in Econ 101 is, which one is the money? And the answer is, we don't know, or it depends. It depends on what these two people think is the money. It could be the shell, it could be the metal coin. Currency is determined by what people agree to be currency. For a short period of time, at the end of the Second World War in Germany, cigarettes were currency. Actual currency, yes. For a short time, that was the case. So could Bitcoin be currency? It could. It's possible. I have my doubts. I think what it will probably end up being is, well, sort of what it is now, which is a sort of a risky asset class, very risky, volatile asset class. But the idea of digital money is, well, on the one hand, different from cryptocurrency. But digital money could be something that is very, very, in fact, it's very probable. The Chinese have already started issuing a digital yuan, for instance. That type of digital money is called central bank digital currency, CBDC, central bank digital currency. And unlike cryptocurrency, which isn't backed by anything except our agreement that this is money, central bank digital currencies are backed by national central banks. And so in many ways, it sort of looks like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, but in many significant ways, it's not. And I think it's probably the more realistic future of digital currency. As I said, the Chinese have already started issuing digital yuan. What's interesting is the theoretical possibility, and I think it's part of what interests the Chinese government so much, is that with digital currency, you can make it programmable. And what that means is, and again, no one has done this yet. This is still sort of in the theoretical realm, the possibility realm. But one of the things the Chinese are very concerned about is the spread or the use of currency outside of Chinese borders. With a digital currency, that's something that could be controlled, could be programmed into the money. You can only make purchases here. And it would monitor purchases that would say go elsewhere, go to buy oil or something like that. Or for criminal purposes, which is something, of course, that cryptocurrency is very much used for. But a programmable money, of course, has all kinds of political and ethical implications to it, which is part of the reason why I think there'll be some governments that will be very interested to start issuing digital money. The future of money, the future of economic systems, is as much digital, I think, as anything else. Environmental systems, also very difficult to think about and imagine. So almost daily, we are getting reminders that the West is running out of water. The most recent in the headlines is the Great Salt Lake, which I'm led to believe that within 5 years or so will be completely dried up. It's astonishing to see what's happened to the Great Salt Lake, and it is hardly exceptional in what's happening in the western United States. Added to that, of course, are the wildfires that every summer seem to become more numerous and more intense. And we're reaching a stage where it's possible that the southwestern United States is going to be not uninhabitable, but maybe inhospitable. And I've been working through a scenario or thinking through some possibilities where people living in the Southwest start to make decisions like, do I really want to live here? We're already starting to see some evidence of people leaving some parts of the Southwest for other parts of the country because of water, because of access to water. In November, I was at a conference at Arizona State. And things certainly felt very arid. I was kind of surprised to see sort of a fountain or a water sculpture at the university. I thought, wow, that seems sort of inappropriate in many ways, but this is how they're living in Phoenix and in Tempe. We already know, it wasn't the number one reason, but one of the reasons that Intel gave for locating their chip manufacturing plant on the east side of Columbus or in Licking County, one of the reasons given was we need 5 million gallons of water a day. And there's water here. It's one reason, not the only reason, it's one reason the location is here and say not in Arizona or something like that. We could, I think it's possible, I think it's very possible that we're going to start to see an exodus of people from cities like Phoenix, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, and they're going to start moving to other parts of the country because of their access to water there. And if that seems outlandish, well, people aren't going to move. They're still moving to the Southwest. We're not going to see a movement of people like that. In fact, we have seen it once before in our history. We saw a pretty mass movement of people. It started after the Second World War, but really accelerated in the 1970s. The move to the Sun Belt, which, and I'm simplifying here, was largely from the Northeast to the Southwest and the South. A mass movement of people mostly to jobs, mostly for high-tech jobs and the nicer climate, nicer in the context of the 1970s and 80s. It is possible because of the drought that's, well, not so much a drought as sort of this is the way the world is going to lead a lot of people to want to start coming to where the water is. And as it turns out, here in the Midwest, we actually have a lot of water. It's one thing we do have. Not to say that with ecological change that this is going to be a paradise. It's still going to be warmer and more humid. There's still other sorts of problems. But water is still very, very much an attraction here. And there's already been some moves to sort of say, hey, you folks have lots of water. Why don't we build a pipeline or something like that to places over here where we can use the water? And a lot of the governors over here in this part are saying, yeah, no, we don't want to do that. And we could very well see some conflicts set up about the geography of water within the United States. I think the possibility is that we will see a mass movement of people back to these areas, to Columbus, but also to St. Paul, to Des Moines, to Madison, to other sorts of cities, not just Columbus, but I think Columbus is certainly going to be a recipient here. Climate migration or climate migrants is the term that we're starting to see used more and more to describe this effect. Geopolitical systems, something of particular interest to me. One effect that we're seeing is a phenomenon that I'm calling, I think others are starting to call, deglobalization. I think we are starting to live in a period that we can call deglobalization. The editor of my Visionary Histories book didn't like this. He says, no, you're way off base there. You're way off base. He's since changed his views about that, given events that have occurred. And one of those one event, not what influenced my editor, one event is the Russo-Ukrainian War. One effect of the sanctions against Russia from the West is to try to extricate Russia from the global economy. If globalization started, and this is a rough date, if it started at the end of the Cold War, 1990, we've been living under an economic system where goods, services, information, data flows pretty freely across the globe. And companies go to where, for instance, labor is least expensive, or they start producing where their consumer bases lie. And there's been quite a lot of rethinking about that strategy. And we see it represented in all sorts of ways. I talked about money just a moment ago. As of right now, the dollar is still the global reserve currency. The Chinese are starting to make efforts. It's happening sort of slowly. It's happening sort of on the fringes. But they are making moves to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency with the yuan. I'll just give you one data point about this. The Chinese have been attempting to purchase Saudi oil in yuan rather than dollars. Most commodities, international commodity trades, are traded in dollars. They would very much like that to be the yuan. I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow, but a possibility for the future is the dollar is no longer the global reserve currency as it has been since the end of the Second World War. This is a diagram that shows Operation Warp Speed, which I think was the singular achievement of the previous administration. One effect of Operation Warp Speed was it brought together government agencies and private companies, corporations, to achieve a goal. Vaccines were made and put in people's arms in about a year. That's astonishing. We've not seen anything like that before. Usually that process takes years to accomplish. We did it now, the mRNA technology already existed. It had already been around for about 20 years or so. Operation Warp Speed was hugely successful. And it's led some to wonder what other sorts of problems could we be solving if we could harness both the power of the state and the power of corporations, rather than seeing them in competition with each other, rather than seeing the state as some sort of regulator of business. What if they were working together, especially toward national ends? This is, I'm going to get a little wonky, but and I'll explain the significance. This is the Endless Frontier Act, which was introduced in the Senate in April of 2021. This bill establishes a directorate for technology and innovation in the NSF and establishes various programs and activities. The goals of the directorate shall be the strengthening of U.S. leadership in critical technologies through basic research in key technology focus areas, such as artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, advanced manufacturing, and the commercialization of those technologies. That's the big significance. The NSF has never been so directed. The NSF has sort of given funds based on what researchers were interested in studying. Now, a directorate within the NSF is going to say, we're going to give you money because we want you to focus on these particular problems. And you should read this, of course. In the background is looming China, of course. That's the competitor in each one of these areas. What if government, in a sense, were to start act as a kind of venture capitalist, especially for risky sorts of investments? The Intel plant is certainly evidence of this. Maybe not of government as venture capitalist, but certainly the idea of bringing manufacturing here, rather than having chips crucial to the world economy, as we saw during the pandemic, rather than having chips manufactured in maybe politically volatile places, we should bring that manufacturing here. The economist Mariana Mazzucato has written a couple of books about this idea of government as a kind of venture capitalist, especially for risky investments that most venture capitalists won't touch. That's why she talks about a moonshot guide to capitalism. We need more moonshots like this. This is a working paper that was published just a couple of years ago, talking about the emergence of strategic capitalism. And what's meant by that is that governments, rather than letting the economic system work according to the dictates of the free market, especially when that works to our national disadvantage, that the state starts to make a more active role in protecting and advancing certain national industries. The future possibility is that we're going to see a capitalism that looks more like strategic capitalism. It's too dark right now for me to see, but I wonder if any of my students are here that have started a futurist club here at Ohio State. I worked with a group of students last semester on history and future. I was teaching them sort of techniques, how historians can make good futurists. Wonderful group of students whom I discovered about halfway through the class that one of the things that they liked doing was, they like thinking about the future. They like thinking about different sorts of possibilities. I introduced them to a technique that would allow them to design the future that they want. And what they said to me is, Dr. Staley, we want to do more of these exercises. Because what I learned from these students is that they actually have they're actually quite afraid of the future. They actually have a lot of misgivings about the future. And the technique I'll describe here, called idealized design, said it gave us a sense that we have some agency over the future. Let me explain what I mean by this. By the way, they started a club, the Buckeye Futures Club. Happy to talk with any of you about this. You're looking at the faculty advisor, the proud faculty advisor of the Buckeye Futures Club. What if we thought about history as the design of the future behavior of complex adaptive systems? In other words, design the future that we want. Rather than thinking in terms of scenarios where we start in the present and think through all the different possibilities, different sorts of scenarios, what if we started instead in the future? And the future that we start with is the future that we want. So my students would say things like, we want to eliminate carbon emissions. We live in a future where carbon emissions have been reduced such that the planet is no longer under threat. Great, wonderful vision. Idealized design then says you start working backwards toward the present. What has to happen to achieve that preferable future? And you really have to push anyone that does this process, you have to push really hard on it. So one change would be, a change in the political class in Washington to be more open to this. Terrific, okay, how is that accomplished? And we push that, and we push that, and we push that. And eventually you get back to the present, and what you have is a roadmap of this very, very complex system. But rather than, as I said before, technologists, well, we'll just sort of unleash a technology and sort of see what happens. This is a much more deliberative process about thinking through the future. But nevertheless, gives students a feeling that they can design the future that they want, to have some control over a future that they see as chaotic and unpredictable. I hope I've convinced you, I hope that I've been able to demonstrate that being an historian makes one an excellent futurist, one who is a scholar of possibility. Thanks very much for your time and attention. And I believe we have time for questions, yes?
Thanks very much to David for that wonderful talk. We do have time for questions. So let's start by seeing some hands, and I'll either pass you a mic or repeat the question. Anybody feeling bold?
John, right over here.
Go ahead. Just shout it out.
Say it one more time, please. Complex and complicated. So complex, so the question is, what's the difference between complex and complicated? So I've already sort of laid out what complex behaviors are. Complicated means that, so a complicated system would be an internal combustion engine. It's very complicated. It has lots of moving parts. It requires specialized skill to be able to understand it. But the behaviors are very rarely emergent and very rarely nonlinear, for instance. So that'd be an example of a complicated system, as opposed to, say, a rainforest. Have you ever flown? Has anybody ever flown into Hawaii before? As you're about ready to land in Hawaii, what do they have you do? There's the air attendants. They go around. They hand in pieces of paper. You have to declare any sort of food that you might have. And in fact, I think you have to throw it away when you land. Am I remembering that right? You have to throw it away, but you have to declare any sort of food that you have. Why would they do that in Hawaii? It has to do with the ecosystem. You would be introducing something into the ecosystem. Remember, we talk about complex systems are such that a small change can, if not careful, can lead to outsized effects. They are very, very sensitive to you bringing food in and taking food out. My wife had an apple. I think we bought an apple at the snack shop, and we were about ready to go through TSA, and they said, eat it before you go on. You can't take it with you. Seriously? The same is true with Australia. They are very, very sensitive about their environment because they've been burned before. That's what we mean by complex systems. It's largely because of the unpredictable sorts of effects that even a small change can have in them. I hope it's an answer. I don't know if it's the best answer. It's certainly an answer.
Let's see. Wow, a lot of hands going up now. Okay. So right there with the glasses, go ahead.
So I'm curious, do you foresee a future in which
So the question is, can I imagine a future where historians would put together a quantitative, mathematical, either projection of the future or explanation of the past? And the answer is, not only can I see it, there are some historians that are doing just that. So, actually, I suppose I could debate with my colleagues whether Peter Turchin is in fact an historian or maybe an historical sociologist. But if you look at the work of Peter Turchin, he has done exactly that. He is claimed to have made a mathematical model of history, of the past, and as a result, has made mathematical predictions about the future. Maybe during the reception period, I can maybe point by point reject this. I actually have lots of problems with his approach. But it gets a lot of attention. His approach gets lots of attention. At last, we have the mathematics of history. I have questions. I have questions about it. But yes, there are and in fact, this has long been a desire. Frankly, it's not historians. It's people that want to sort of appropriate history to turn them into mathematical models. Most historians, I think, would reject that idea. And I think if you press them, it's because we understand we understand that systems are inherently unpredictable. And even if you formalize them in mathematics, it still wouldn't give you the kind of prediction that some would find comforting. I hope that you leave this talk today not with certainty about the future, but with clarity about the future. And I think that is something we can definitely achieve.
Go ahead, sir.
So I thought it was interesting you talked about, technologists put things out into the wild and they like to think maybe they know it's going to happen, but then the system itself changes it. Do you think that we saw the same effect from technology of the Industrial Revolution that we've now seen, whether it's social media or remote work technology, speeding up change in society and getting, some people would say it's gotten out of hand on both cases? Or
No question, Will. No question at all. I don't have the reference right in front of me. I don't have the person, but it was a newspaper clipping from, I think, around 1900. Someone in the UK that said, "Boy, if we keep burning coal like this, we're going to burn up the planet. It's going to get, the atmosphere is going to get too hot." But that's okay. That's at least 3 or 4 centuries away. So there were people that were sort of thinking in these terms. I wrote a piece a while back called "The Responsibility of Imagination." And I'm not going to talk about who the person is. He was a technologist. I don't want to throw him under the bus. But he was talking about, and I can't remember which technology it was, some, I think deep fake, some sort of technology, sort of said, yeah, sure there might be unforeseen effects or something like that, but it was like nuclear weapons, right? We thought, there were people at the time that thought we'd blow up the planet or, incinerate the atmosphere, and that didn't happen, so stop worrying. And I said, hold on. There's a reason why we didn't blow up the planet. There's a reason why the atmosphere didn't incinerate, and had to do with the kinds of guardrails and systems and institutions that were put in place. And I think the attitude of some technologists is sort of, well, we're going to do this, because we'll make a lot of money, and we'll let someone else worry about the consequences. And so when I say they have the unforeseen consequences are oftentimes because we don't want to see them. We choose not to see them. I'd like to be proven wrong about that, but I don't think I am.
Sir in the back. Yep.
So, unforeseen consequence or unintended consequence, how do you reconcile that in your tool where you look at the before future and then you kind of work back? But unforeseen circumstances or unforeseen
Yeah, so it's a good question. Yeah, so the question is using the idealized design technique. How do you avoid the unforeseen consequences effect? And I suppose the simple answer is you can't. But you try not to, or you try to mitigate that. In other words, you go into the exercise thinking, I need to push my thinking to look for the unexpected, to look for the surprise. And I think the idea of sort of identifying the conditions that have to be in place for the ideal future to be there almost forces, in fact, it does force you to think about the sorts of changes that need to take place. It won't be perfect, and there will be things that won't be foreseen. But every time I've done this exercise, largely with students, they realize that the sorts of changes that they would like to see are not as simple as they thought. Well, all we have to do is, start this policy. All we have to do is elect this person president. What they realize is that the kinds of systemic change that they're interested in just is much more complex than that. And if that exercise does nothing else, it sensitizes them to that. Yeah, but I don't know if there's any way to completely see everything. I mean, we'd be omniscient then. We would be, I don't know, we would see through the eyes of God, I suppose.
Let's go ahead.
So you talked a bit about one taking over the currency reserve, and we political scientists also talk about this a lot. I know we're not making predictions, but do you have maybe a time frame when you would think that this might happen, or do you think that this is, a real threat?
So those are two questions, or two different frameworks. So the question is the scenario I laid out of the yuan becoming the global digital, or becoming the global currency reserve. Is that, what's the time frame? And the other question you asked was, do I think it's a possibility? So the time frame, so I'll put a time frame on it, though I think that this is probably artificial. 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years. And I say that because looking at the situation right now, most economists would say, no, that's not the case. So I've seen various numbers for this, but I think if you look in terms of global transactions, it's about 60% in dollars, 60%. The nearest competitor would be the euro. It's something like 25%. The yuan right now is about 3%. So just looking at the numbers right now, I'd sort of say, well, that doesn't seem possible, right? Or certainly not tomorrow, or certainly not in 5 or 10 years. But was it Hemingway that said change what? It happens gradually and then all of a sudden. And that's what I'm sort of laying out right there. It could be that sort of nonlinear kind of change that right now seems unlikely. But again, I'm watching to seeing other sorts of behaviors and things. And especially as the global economy starts to bifurcate away from this period of globalization, if it starts to bifurcate, what we could see maybe very clearly are two sort of currency regimes, a dollar-dominated one and a yuan-dominated one. That strikes me as very, very possible. Again, I hope I'm wrong about that. I really want to be wrong about that.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll go for the break. Go ahead.
By no means am I a political historian, but political historians, do they look back at all the crap that's occurred in the last couple of 100 years and view today as just a continuation of what was happening in the 1700s, the 1800s, the political infighting and so forth? Should I be encouraged that nothing's new?
So the question is, do political historians look back, and I think the technical term was look at the crap that's existed in the past and sort of carry that forward to the present and maybe see similar sort of crap today. So I think that political historians are just historians generally. One of the things that defines our method, in fact, I think it's one of the reasons why we make excellent futurists, is that we as historians, we tend not to think in terms of general theories. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think in the social sciences, the impulse is to want to learn a phenomenon, study a phenomenon from the past, learn its essential features, develop a theory that can then be used to explain similar sorts of things in other situations and contexts. So revolution, let's take that, to take a political scientist, revolution. The impulse would be to create a theory of revolution, that for a revolution to occur, this has to happen, this has to happen, this has to happen, and it will lead to X, Y, and Z effects. That's not how historians tend to approach the past, I think. I don't think I'm oversimplifying too much to say that historians see the American Revolution as different from the French Revolution, as different from the Haitian Revolution, as different from the Russian Revolution. There are patterns in commonality, but it's the differences that maybe are most significant. I tell my history students, we are experts in context. We understand the significance and importance of context. I guess a physicist would call that sensitivity to initial conditions. That's why an historian would not develop a theory of revolution, because the situations are so different. This is why it's sometimes problematic to look for historical analogies. But it's a very typical sort of impulse. So when the US unexpectedly pulled out of Kabul in August of 2021, immediately in the media it's like, this is Saigon, 1975. And the thinking is that this is exactly like that situation, and therefore it's going to unfold exactly the way it did in Vietnam in 1975. Whereas an historian would say that's an analogy. And an analogy is defined as a similarity in the midst of difference. And what typically happens when people resort to analogies is that they look only at the similarities and don't pay enough attention to the differences. One of the things I was asked about the fall of Kabul was, maybe Saigon 1975 is the wrong analogy. What if it were Lebanon 1983? Maybe that's a better analogy. After 9/11, I was teaching at another university, and I was asked by the student media. Said, this is just like Pearl Harbor. And a lot of people were saying, this is Pearl Harbor. I said, actually, I don't think that's the right analogy. I said, if you're looking for a better analogy, I think it's the Tet Offensive in 1968. Choosing the right analogy, again, with the understanding that very rarely, if ever, do events occur exactly as they did in the past, is one of the strengths of historical thinking. And again, I think what makes us exceptional futurists.
Okay, so
It's a good question.
I'll close with two questions for everybody. First is, would you like to meet the speaker and join us for a cup of coffee and a cookie? That's in the traditions room, and to get there, basically, we'll go out.
It's clear they want the cookies and the coffee more than the speaker, but go ahead, John.
We'll go out and basically go up one floor, and it's kind of that way. And the second question is, would you like to join me in thanking the speaker?
Oh, thank you. Thank you.